Hey weavers, and welcome to this Dueling Rabbits Productions video about another awesome thing to try on the Drawloom. Today's topic is Pseudo-Damask, an unusual structure that you don't see too often, but that definitely deserves to be woven more. If you've never come across Pseudo-Damask before, have no fear. In the first half of this video, we will take an exhaustive look at the structure and its variations. In the second half, we will see how it is set up and woven on the drawloom. In his treatise Pattern and Loom, John Becker associates pseudo-damask with both lampas and samatum, while also noting that it is kind of its own thing. Other references to the textile are sparse in the how-to literature. Although Warp and Weft give it a couple of pages, and I relied on them heavily for this project, I feel the lack of corroborating texts means we can tinker with this structure to our heart's content, without fear of breaking any hard and fast rules. I first wove it at Vevstuga Weaving School, where it was used to demonstrate the use of a skeleton tie-up for expanding the block building capabilities of a single harness countermarch loom. This is what I wove, a cushion cover in cotton and wool with 4 pattern blocks. There are clearly 2 different structures at work. In these gold-colored weft effect areas, we can see the diagonal lines of a 1-3 straight twill. In this red-colored area, we see a warp effect plain weave variant that looks very similar to rep. Let's take a closer look at the requirements for the structure. Pseudo-Damask utilizes 2 warps. Erickson et al. Call them the pattern warp and the tie-down warp, so I do too. The pattern warp is thicker than the tie-down warp and doubled, so the ratio of pattern to tie-down ends is 2:1. Both warps are usually the same color. Here they're red, as in the cushion cover I showed you earlier. The loom is threaded thusly: 2 pattern ends, 1 tie-down, 2 pattern ends, 1 tie-down, 2 pattern ends, 1 tie-down, repeating these groups of 3 ends all the way across the warp. In addition to 2 warps, Pseudo-Damask requires 2 wefts. I think of them as foundation weft and plain weave weft, though I conceptualize the foundation weft differently than Erickson et al. For me, the foundation weft is the thicker of the 2. In my cushion, it was doubled Mobilota wool. This weft shows best if it is a contrasting color to the warp, gold in this case. The plain weave weft is typically the same size and color as the tie-down ends. We can see them in red here. On this side of the cloth, the plain weave weft is covered up by the thicker foundation weft. This is the side of the cloth that faces up while we are weaving. It shows the gold wool with its clear twill diagonals. The other side of the cloth shows columns of pattern warp tightly packed in the manner of rep weave. Let's take a closer look at the structure itself. I've blown up my drawdown and changed some of the colors so you can see better. In this version, my pattern ends are blue and my tie-down ends are red. My plain weave weft is drawn in thick and colored white. The foundation weft is gold as before. Plain weave first. Plain weave is constructed by treadling the pattern warp against the tie-down warp. In plain weave row A, we can see the white weft traveling under all the blue pattern ends and over all the red tie-downs. In plain weave row B, we see the opposite. Plain weave weft is traveling over the blue ends and under the red ones. Depending on the thickness of the foundation weft, the plain weave rows may all but disappear on this side of the cloth. In our foundation rows, the thick gold weft skims over most of the warp, tied down only by each red end in turn. You can see that the tie-down ends are threaded in 4-end straight twill, although this does not always have to be the case. The treadling of pseudo-damask can vary according to the effect desired by the weaver. In the case of this cushion cover, 2 foundation picks were thrown for every plain weave pick, as shown. Now, there seems to be no hard and fast rule to keep a whimsical weaver from treadling foundation to plain weave using different orders and ratios one to the other. The appearance of the cloth, of course, would be slightly altered by these mods. The tie-down ends in the foundation cloth can interlace with the foundation weft in different structures, including other twills and satins. Here, for example, is the foundation cloth in 5-end satin. Note the distinctive interlacements obeying the satin counter rules. Stay tuned until the end of this video for further discussion, and note that on the other side of our cloth we see the same rep-like plain weave that we saw before. So that's the foundation cloth, but what if we want to add pattern? Like conventional damask, we do this by weaving both faces of the structure on the same side of the cloth. For this project, I chose the foundation cloth as background for my plain weave pattern because I love how it looks, but it's not uncommon to think of them the other way around. You can see this on my cushion cover, where the red, rep-like plain weave shows pattern against the gold twill foundation cloth. If we turn the cover inside out, we can see all the weave feathers that it picked up from the cushion that's usually inside. We can also see that the plain weave serves as background, while the foundation cloth, which on this side is 3-1 rather than 1-3 twill, is being used for pattern. You may love how this looks, but I don't. I consider this to be the wrong side of the cloth, and you're not going to see much of it in this video, FYI. However you conceptualize this cloth on a single harness loom, it is a very treadle-hungry weave. Erickson is to be believed a 4-block pattern woven with a 4-end, non-reversing, straight twill foundation would require 18 treadles. This problem can be got round with skeleton tie-ups where some treadles do double duty and others are not tied to every shaft. This reduces the number of treadles considerably, but even with this protocol, 10 treadles would be required for the same structure. I've done it. It's mind-bending and limiting. I believe ambitious weavers usually get out their dobby looms at this point. I don't have a dobby loom, which leads us to the burning question. Can pseudo-damask be woven simply and easily on a drawloom? The answer is, of course, a resounding yes. It's awesome. Here's why we can do it. Pseudo-damask is a true unit weave. I'm calling this thing here a unit for design purposes. It is 1 repeat of our 4-end twill foundation cloth. It is 12 warp ends wide and 8 picks tall. Here is the blue pattern warp and the red tie-down warp we saw earlier. This is the thick gold foundation weft and the hypothetical white plain weave weft. 4 foundation picks are required for 1 repeat of our 1-3 twill. The interlacement with the tie-down ends gives us those strong twill diagonals. Rows 2 and 6 are identical plain weave picks that I've designated as plain weave A, where the pattern warp forms the top of the shed. Rows 4 and 8 are plain weave B, where the tie-down ends are on top. After a lot of experimenting, I decided I liked the cloth best when I alternated foundation picks and plain weave picks, but there's a lot of leeway here. Knock yourself out and try different combos when you do this on your own loom. For the project on my Drawloom now, I'm using blue for both my warps and the plain weave weft, and a thick pink foundation weft. Here's the foundation cloth, here's the pattern. In real life, it looks like this. Here is 1 foundation repeat with its clear 1-3 twill progression. On this side of the cloth, which faces up when I'm weaving, this is serving as background. Here is the opposite side where the large area of pattern is showing in its reverse 3-1 twill face. As I said, don't like it. Going to ignore it for the rest of this video. With our structure thoroughly understood, let's wind the warps. Recall that our warps are arranged in groups of 3, 2 thick pattern ends for each thinner tie-down end. For my current project, I'm using 2 ends of 8-2 cotton for pattern and 1 of 16-2 cotton for tie down. I'm winding them together, holding all 3 in my hand at once. You can see the groups of 3 as they pass through the lease. This foresight will make life very easy when we dress the loom. When the warp is beamed, you can see my groups of 3 coming off the lease, 2 thick, 1 thin. They are wound on the same beam because I only have one. For a short warp like this isn't a problem, although for a longer warp, some sort of differential take-up mitigation strategy might be required. The first thing we're going to do is thread our pattern leashes. Only the thick pattern ends are going to be threaded onto the leashes. Why? Because we're going to treat them separately from our tie-down ends so we can raise and lower them independently when we are treadling plain weave. Because the pattern ends act in pairs, they can go through the same eye of a pattern heddle. You can see what I'm doing here. My tie-down ends are bypassing the pattern leashes and progressing straight to the ground harness. When the leashes at the back of the loom are all threaded, we set up the remaining shafts so we can thread them too. I've got 5 of them. The rearmost one is loaded up with long eye heddles. We'll be threading our pattern warp onto these. The 4 shafts in front are outfitted with ordinary standard heddles. These shafts are for our foundation cloth, 4 shafts for 4-end twill. Here's the setup for 1 repeat of the threading. I've got my long eye heddle on the rearmost shaft here. I'm calling this shaft plain weave A because it alone will be raised when I treadle plain weave A. These are my 4 standard heddles arranged in a straight draw on the 4 twill shafts in front. Here is my pattern leash with my 4 pairs of thick pattern ends. My tie-down ends are in there too, although they are not threaded through the pattern heddles. I pick off my first pair of pattern ends and thread them through the first long eye heddle on plain weave A. Next, I select that pair's accompanying tie-down coming straight off the lease. That gets threaded onto the heddle on shaft 1 at the back of my pack of 4. My next pattern pair gets threaded through the next long eye heddle on plain weave A. Its accompanying tie-down end, again straight off the lease, gets threaded onto shaft number 2. Pattern ends through another long eye heddle, and the next tie-down on shaft number 3. Final pair of pattern ends through the final long eye heddle, and the final tie-down on shaft number 4 at the front. We will continue this way all across the warp. If you've seen my Beiderwand video, this will probably remind you of that. It's kind of a similar setup. It seems to be a good idea to have all 3 ends of each group share a dent in the reed. This is a 50-10 metric reed, and I've combined each pair of pattern ends with its accompanying tie-down thusly. When the shafts are in place and the warps are tied on, this is what we've got. My leashes of 8 pattern ends are back here on the pattern shafts, arranged in a single point. My ground harness is here at the front. Plain weave A with its long eye heddles and pattern warp is at the rear of these. The 4 twill shafts with their standard heddles and tie-downs are here at the front. If we survey our loom from the side, we can see the 2 warps in their layers. The pattern warp, weighted by lingos, is the layer at the bottom. The tie-down warp, which bypasses the leashes, floats above. They come together towards the reed. Here's a close-up of the ground harness. The pattern warp on the bottom passes through long eye heddles on the shaft for plain weave A. The warp is resting at the bottoms of the long eyes. The tie-down ends above are threaded in turn on the 4 twill shafts, passing through the centers of the heddle eyes as on a conventional single harness loom. These 4 shafts necessarily sit a bit below plain weave A. Hopefully, when we examine the tie-ups, this will all start to make sense. I am using a counter march for this project, so I am tying up both the upper and lower lambs. We'll concentrate on the lower lambs because their tie-ups are easier to see. Plain weave first. Here's our tie-up for plain weave A, the shaft with all the pattern ends. For our first plain weave shed, this shaft only is lifted. You can see that here. Every end in our dense pattern warp is at the top of the shed. Plain weave B requires that all our tie-downs be lifted, so all our twill shafts, threaded with tie-down ends, must be connected to a second treadle via the long lambs. When this treadle is pressed, all our tie-down ends are raised, forming the top of our second plain weave shed. Twill shafts next. These are tied up for straight twill. Remember, when we operate these shafts, only 1 in 4 tie-down ends is raised. You can see how far apart the interlacements in our foundation cloth will be. Unusually for a drawloom setup, the only shaft not to have a counteraction tie-up is plain weave shaft A, the back. This is shown in gray on the tie-up diagram. The lower lamb for this shaft is the only one that needs elastics to snap it back to neutral. Once all this is done, treadling this structure is a breeze. We'll be throwing our thick pink wool when we treadle the foundation twill and our thin blue weft when we treadle plain weave. The order is simple. Foundation 1, plain weave A, foundation 2, plain weave B. Foundation 3, plain weave A, foundation 4, plain weave B. When no pattern shafts are raised, we get our twill foundation cloth. When all our pattern shafts are raised, we get our blue rep variation. And when I raise some of my pattern shafts, excitement starts to happen. If you have an eagle eye, you might notice that the foundation weft does not appear in multiples of 4 as you might expect. Experiments revealed that in order for my pattern to be square, I needed to weave 5 each of my foundation and plain weave picks for every pattern pull. It's a pain treadling 4 against 5, but we must all be prepared to suffer for our art. Let's put it all together. This is the simple pattern I came up with as a proof of concept. On my single point threading, it will be repeated once on the cloth. I'm about to weave this row here. Before I start pulling handles, I need to clarify one last time. Erickson et al. Instruct the reader to pull the pattern shafts for background rather than pattern, thus reversing the look of the textile. Try both and see which you like better. I'm raising the shafts that I want to show blue pattern. When I do this, all the associated pattern ends are raised with them. You can see them here. The independent operation of the plain weave structure means this area appears in blue on the surface of the cloth that faces up when I am weaving. Next, I press the treadle for my first foundation row. From the side, we can see the foremost twill shaft going up. Notice there is none of the usual crisscrossing that happens when we are weaving true twill or satin damask. Our 4 twill shafts are operating on their own, producing our foundation cloth. Where pattern shafts are raised, my pink foundation weft will pass almost invisibly under the blue pattern ends. Where shafts are unraised, my foundation weft will be tied down at widely spaced intervals, continuing the twill line from the previous foundation pick. I throw the foundation pick for this row. Next, I press the treadle for plain weave A. Rearmost ground shaft plain weave A only goes up, bringing my unraised pattern ends up to meet the ones already raised by the pattern harness. You can see above the card that every pattern end is now at the top of the shed. When I throw my plain weave weft, it will contribute to my rep variant, but disappear between the wool weft in the areas where foundation is being woven. Foundation 2 next, the next row in my twill cloth. Twill shaft number 3 goes up, carrying with it 1 tie-down end for every 4. These join the pattern ends already raised by the pattern harness. I throw another foundation pick. Plain weave B now. For this row, we bring all our tie downs to the top of the shed. This means raising all our twill shafts so the tie downs rise above all the pattern ends, including the ones lowered by the tie up for the pattern harness. Tie downs will contribute to our rep-like pattern, but the row will disappear between the foundation wefts that come before and after. I continue in this manner until all the foundation and plain weave rows for this pattern block are complete. Then I change my poles and repeat the process until I'm done. Remember how I mentioned the foundation cloth for Pseudo-Damask can be lots of different structures? Here's how. Let's say we want our foundation cloth to be in 5-end satin. All we have to do is create the setup for 5-end satin on the ground harness in front of the plain weave A shaft. This would mean threading our tie-down ends in a straight draw over 5 shafts instead of 4. To do this, we would add one more shaft with standard heddles here. We would also need to add sufficient lambs to tie up for our new foundation structure. Regardless of the structure, we would leave the rising connection for plain weave shaft A untouched and tie up all our remaining shafts for plain weave B. The rest of the tie-up is dependent on our structure of choice. For this example, we would use the classic tie-up for 5-end satin as woven with a countermarch. Can you derive the tie-up for Pseudo-Damask with a 6-end irregular satin foundation? I'll give you a hint. You'll need 7 ground shafts and 8 treadles. However it's woven, Pseudo-Damask on the Drawloom is fun to weave, beautiful, and satisfyingly different, with lots of potential for experimentation at the loom. I hope you try it soon, and as always, thank you so much for watching.